Hello everyone, I'm Asbed Bedrosian and I'm here with Hovik Manoucharian. We're going to discuss a case of a ruling party official essentially bullying a journalist and a media outlet into silence through the Armenian court system. In Dikran Avinyan's civil court case against 168 AM, Hayruvatsun Uttajam, and journalist David Sarkisian, the judge has decided to freeze $46,000 of the defendant's assets, which is an unprecedented development according to the Union of Journalists in Armenia. Avinyan alleges that the media outlet slandered him by publishing a video that says that he is one of a number of the newly enriched in Pashinyan's close circle of ruling party cronies. In this segment, we're not so much interested in the allegations, either in the video or in the suit, but as a media outlet ourselves, we're interested and concerned about the effect of such legal action and the resulting court response on the media in Armenia. We're joined by Rupen Melikian, who was formerly Artsak's Human Rights Ombudsman, and prior to that, he was rector of the Justice Academy of Armenia. In 2019, Melikian co-founded and currently leads the Path of Law Iravagan Uri NGO. Welcome back to the show, Rupen. Thanks for taking our questions today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Hello, Ruben.
Rupen, the case is still ongoing, obviously, and the verdict has not been issued. But is it normal for a court to come down with harsh punitive measures like this before a verdict is issued?
Well, this issue is not new in Armenia. There are cases not related to media and other vulnerable institutions where this kind of issues happened in the past. But this is the first time that this kind of issue happens with media. So it can be deemed as punitive measure. So there is an institution in our civil code which gives the right to the judges, first of all, to the applicants, to the plaintiffs, and secondly, to the judges to apply the freezing mechanism. But the judge should carefully kind of not investigate, but look the case and should see what kind of public interests are involved in that case. In this particular case, there is very important public interest issue connected with normal operation of a very popular media outlet in Armenia. So 168.am is a media which is headed by the head of the Union of Journalists of Armenia.
Right.
So that's not the last media in our media atmosphere, let's say.
Right.
So,
Satik Seyranyan is head of the Journalistic Union.
So taking into account the considerations of that kind, I would say that this is unusual measure that was taken by the court. And one of the reasons that this is unprecedented is that I personally took part in many cases like this. So the cases where the slander, when alleged defamation issues arose from the applications of the plaintiffs related to the ruling party. But I don't remember any case that the plaintiff asked the court, made an action of freezing the operational budget of media, of journalists. By the way, also he is very famous one. David Sarkisian is one of the young leading journalists.
Ruben, in fact, my question was specifically related to that. The court action was in response to Tigran Avinyan's demand,
exactly,
which was to freeze the assets. And note that there's an absence of demand. Some say that the demand could have included maybe taking down the material temporarily. Do you believe that immediately going to this demand of freezing assets, is that normal? And is that goodwill litigation, or is it?
I don't think so. Formally, the plaintiff has the right to ask the court to freeze the assets. So formally, it's within the boundaries of law. But the practice is that in such cases, in cases like this, I haven't heard that any plaintiff asked the same to the court. Although I had many cases like this, So what I'm saying is that this is unusual, not because it's contrary to law to ask the court, but because it's contrary to established practice. And the second issue is that when asked, the judge, the court should have rejected that request, So the court always has right either to grant or to reject the request like that. And there are many cases where courts are rejecting requests of the same kind in unrelated cases. In unrelated cases, the cases which are not related to the media.
Do you suspect administrative pressure being applied on the court to act in this manner? I ask because recently, I believe, in a government session, Nikol Pashinyan talked about his circle and government officials being more strict with cases of alleged defamation. Do you think that statements like that or any other actions by this government could amount to administrative pressure?
Well, in order to understand what the situation is in the judicial branch of our government, I would say that a governing body of the judiciary, for United States, let's say that it's like Supreme Court, right? So we know how the Supreme Court is formed and what are the criteria of becoming a Supreme Court justice, right? In Armenia, the equivalent of that, the so-called Supreme Judicial Council, is composed of 5 specialists, let's say specialists, so far, according to Constitution, which are nominated and elected, appointed by the parliament, and 5 judges elected by the judges themselves. So all five now, the so-called specialists, are in larger or narrower sense connected with civil contract, with Nikol Pashinyan's party. And the head of the Supreme Judicial Council, Karen Andreasyan, is the former Minister of Justice, one of their major party leaders. So that governing body of the judiciary has all the instruments that they can use against judges. And in this situation, it's very, very probable that they could have imposed some pressure to the judges because they have that opportunity, and there is a practice of dismissal of going to so-called disciplinary proceedings via the same Supreme Judicial Council and dismissing the judges.
So, Ruben, freezing the entire operational budget of a media outlet is essentially silencing them. Is this action by the court illegal or unconstitutional? Does it encroach on the rights of the defendant or Hayruvat Sunutujam or David Sarkisyan in any way?
I would not say that it's either legal or unconstitutional because I didn't read the decision. But if the decision is what is enforced, so I would say that it cannot be constitutional. Cannot be constitutional because it's a direct attack on freedom of speech. This is my personal opinion. I'm not involved in the case. Very high-ranked specialists are involved, and I believe that they will use all the measures that are available to the parties to have this decision revoked. Well, the idea is that if any plaintiff, notwithstanding the situation, any plaintiff is going to court and he has some hesitation, not hesitations, but doubts that if the court decision will be in 1 year, 2 years, the subject of the matter will no longer be there, or the enforcement of the decision cannot be done because of financial issues. They have right to ask the court, to request the court to freeze, to make some measures, including to freeze the property. So that was, in fact, what happened in this case. But this theoretical issue has not been a theoretical instrument. It has been applied many times in different cases. For example, there is a dispute over real property, right? And in order to not let the one who has that property in his or her possession and not let him to sell the property, the plaintiff can ask the court to forbid selling the real estate. And that's perfectly normal. So this issue, as in Armenian we say, Haisi Apahovman Mijos, is very frequent, is very often used tool in civil procedure. But in cases which are involving the media and which are cases involving with this or that position, article, or other media activities. This was unusual thing. Indeed, I believe it's the first time. So that
Okay.
is the legal part of it.
Ruben, I'd like to zoom out a little bit and talk about the effect of external factors into all of this. This regime has been criticized by opponents going as far back as the initial days of the so-called revolution in 2018. We remember the cases of surrounding the courthouses in 2019. We remember when this regime attempted to criminalize insults and later it had to decriminalize them due to international pressure, and many other cases, which I don't want to go into the details. But in general, some would say that the international criticism against this regime's attacks against media has been very muted, to say the least. And after all this, international NGOs have only slightly degraded Armenia's rankings in the World Corruption Index, for instance, for one of them, one of the measures. Critics would say that the West and the NGOs are still treating this government with kid gloves. Pashinyan, in turn, for instance, has blamed the media themselves for causing the downgrade through negative reporting. But I wanted to focus on one specific detail. As recently as last week, USAID allocated over 17 million in support of Armenian media. Now we know that traditionally many of the recipients of such aid are, which political camp they belong to. So I want to ask, what is the role of international organizations, the civil rights watchdogs, the NGO community at large in Armenia, enabling this kind of behavior? And have you seen the NGOs, the civil rights community, for instance, criticize Pashinyan regime appropriately for this latest incident?
Well, unfortunately, the context of Armenian governments and international human rights organizations relations is very far from human rights issues. My personal opinion, like opinion of many other people in Armenia, is that international large stakeholders pardon many wrongdoings of Armenian government because of larger political, let's say, scenarios or agenda. And this is one of the examples that human rights issues are not as pure as they were or seemed to be 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, and they are closely connected with political issues. So if even 10% of what this new government, not new, it's already 5 years, the government of Pashinyan has done and is doing against freedom of speech, against independence of judiciary, against other fundamental rights, against the right of fair trial, right of freedom of liberty, freedom of security of people, so not to be arrested voluntarily. So all these issues, if even 10% of what they do had been done by the previous regime, previous government, I don't even imagine what would happen with reports of various international organizations. Statements would be there and other leverage would be used. So I believe that the main reason is political agenda. The political agenda, where still Nikol Pashinyan is. Many people in the West have hopes in Pashinyan and his government's broader policy, let's say, geopolitics.
Ruben, specifically about this one case, the USAID $17 million. In your experience, do we know what this support looks like? What does quote unquote support mean? Where does this money go? Because one thing that came to our attention, according to some metrics, $17 million is more than double the amount of all of the advertising revenue of this industry in Armenia.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. I can only suppose, based on the previous experience, that money could go to the so-called NGO sector, the NGO sector which is accepted by the West, the NGO which partly or even mostly can be described as government NGOs, so GONGOs, government. It's a term, right? GONGO. So GONGOs, which are governments have control over that NGOs. It's one, and second, directly connected with the current government.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us, Ruben. We appreciate your time.
خطرم
Thank you.
love Alex. Listen.
Bye-bye.
Okay, that was our show. We hope you found it informative. Please find us on social media and follow us, like us, subscribe to us, and so on. You can find our links on our profile pages. Thanks, and talk to you soon.